I should preface my comments. Normally, I don't get that autobiographical, but because I'm going to be speaking as an academic, but also because of certain experiences I have when it comes to religions. I was raised Catholic, was a Franciscan for many years, which was another life, and then a young theologian, Catholic theologian, during Vatican II, and then did my PhD in Islam and minored in Hinduism and Buddhism. And so for a good deal of my career taught world religions, and then later on got into the stuff that I've been doing for quite a few years. Just yesterday, a colleague of mine sent me an article that, if you were to read it, and I bring it up only because I want to underscore how we still have all kinds of theories out there with regard to terrorism, an article that pointed out that after 9/11, David Frum, who was one of the top speechwriters for George W. Bush, basically said that the 9/11 attackers and the cause of terrorism was basically, look, they're mostly from Saudi Arabia, and it's the problem of sexual frustration and deprivation. Well, in this article, it then goes to social scientists who then began to write a series of articles basically taking the same position, so that in one of them they concluded that the big problem would be in the Arab world, and particularly Saudi Arabia, but also in China, because, of course, males are privileged and females are not, and therefore you have a surplus of males, so that in terms of dangers of terrorism, you have all of these males who are sexually deprived and frustrated. So it's kind of fascinating. Having been in monasteries for many years, I'm ready to join Che Guevara and conquer the world. Let me begin with some points. Now, Professor Diop gave a very good presentation, and I'm going to make some initial points which for many of you will be accepted. I make them because it lays the foundation for what I'm going to say later, in which I will get into some points with regard to policy that some of you may or may not have problems with. So let me begin with 4 points. All religions, as we talked about earlier, historically have had a transcendent and a dark side. The problem with that is that people can nod yes, but the reality of it is most people, when they talk about religion, compare, if they're religious, their ideal to somebody else's reality. And invariably, when you're in conversations, people, for example, who say that Islam is a particularly violent religion will not look at the Bible. In fact, there are far more passages about violence and even genocide. One needs to get real about that. Or the romance about, well, but it's not true for Hinduism and Buddhism. One need only look at the Rohingya today, but one can also look at the past. All, of course, are sources of peace, but also of extremism, historically and today. While religion is a powerful force, a source of legitimation, recruitment, and mobilization, I would argue that the primary drivers, in most cases, of violence and terrorism today are political, ethnic, and economic grievances, which then get framed, if you're religious folk, in the name of religion. In the old days, it might be in the Middle East, Arab nationalism and socialism, or it might be in the name of Marxism, or frankly, today it can be in the name of democracy or nationalism. Identity politics underlie sectarian and ethnic violence, and I think that that's important, and exacerbate what otherwise are ordinary political and socioeconomic issues. If one looks at Iraq, the dominance of a minority Sunni vis-a-vis the Shia, then the tables change, the problems under Maliki, with the identity politics, the underlying issues really had to do, if you take this, for example, some of the Sunni military who are now with ISIS, they had to do with issues of marginalization and issues of power rather than when I pray and how I pray. Now, I'm not trying to, again, take out the fact that religion can be, a factor. Combating violent extremism simply by focusing on religion and ignoring root causes, and I think that's the most important thing, that our political and economic is a dead end, and I want to emphasize that. That when we talk about, for example, even combating violent extremism, when we excessively emphasize the religious factor and the role that religious folk can play, I would argue that most religious leaders can make great statements. They get archived, no matter how good they are, and one merely remembers it. I know that in my own experience, because I've been involved in some of these and written with great enthusiasm, and then suddenly my book, Future of Islam, and I go back now and think, oh, my God, nobody even knows when I go to an audience and I say, common word, the Aman message. No one in the audience knows. So I think we need to be realistic about that. that in fact, if we don't look at root causes, and I know I have issues of time here, so I'm going to be pretty fast, but let me just give you an example of what I'm talking about in terms of root causes and their importance. A couple of months ago, there was a conference for government agencies, U.S. government agencies, which is a nice umbrella term, meaning we have lots of agencies there. And it was on religion and violence and conflict resolution. And, of course, within about 10 minutes, it was basically dealing with Islam. But at the end of it, there was a very senior Defense Department person who had spent his whole career at the Defense Department, except for a period of being a private consultant, probably making the money and then going back into the Defense Department. And he was speaking then to the mid-level analysts. There were some who were older, but mid-level and younger, and saying, this is the world, as I leave, this is the world that you're getting. And what he said is the following. We went into Afghanistan, didn't amount to anything. We went in a second time, no success. Said the same thing about Iraq. Okay? ISIS, we're going nowhere. Winning minds and hearts, failure. Full stop. He did not mention root causes. He did not mention Arab Spring. He did not mention the fallout from what happened with the Arab Spring. In other words, there was no sense of that dimension of root causes, and I think that's important. A Pew study in 2014 concluded that religious conflicts, which Pew then noted is not necessarily saying that religion is the primary driver, but religious conflicts had reached a 6-year peak. 33% of 198 countries and territories had high religious hostilities. Sharpest increase, no surprise, Middle East and North Africa. Now, we know that since the late 20th century, religious ideology and identity have replaced the role of secular ideologies. And this is true in many parts of the world. And we're not just talking about the Muslim world. So religion becomes an ideological alternative for many to the established order, a form of liberation and resistance, but also of guerrilla warfare, violence, and terror. It's become a mainstay in mainstream politics and society in many countries, a source of national identity, political legitimacy, a moral compass, involved in democratization, but also it's become a major source to legitimate violence and extremism, repression, etc. One can look at the Sisi regime. Sisi now wants to present himself as a religious reformer. He has his grand muftis that he's appointed going around the world now, giving great statements on combating extremism and violence. Nobody talks about what's going on within the country. So you've got a grand mufti out there making statements, but nobody's looking at, A, who appointed the grand mufti, what role does the grand mufti have, whether he likes it or not, and what's going on in the country itself. All you have to do is look at the New York Times in the last week to realize what's going on in the country. Okay, now I want to make another point. Ultra-conservative religious fundamentalisms have their mainstream and their extremist side. So you can't just use the word, for example, Wahhabi and Salafi as if that always means something militant, okay? That's important. Therefore, there's a nonviolent and a violent form. Now, mainstream fundamentalisms are exclusivist theologies, and they're a problem in a modern world, from my point of view. They're weak on religious pluralism, weak on tolerance, vis-a-vis other faiths, but also within the faiths, and we see that playing out today. Within Christianity, between mainline and other forms, and the Christian right, within Roman Catholicism. I mean, you can see it within all the religious traditions. But the important thing is that these religious exclusivist theologies, and I would say whether of any religion, if it's religiously exclusivist in the modern world, it becomes an enabler for terrorists. Because what terrorists do is come along and say, this is an imperative. You see, it's exclusivist, we're right. For example, the monotheistic faiths, God has given us this command. That command is the imperative. As I like to say, if you're going to make a place more Christian, you don't say from the conservative, ultra-conservative side, let alone for the terrorists, you don't say, well, we'll do 1 through 5 of the commandments now and 6 through 10 later because we have co-ed dorms in America, Europe's becoming promiscuous. I say that to my European colleagues. I'm a prophetic voice on this. In America, we're fine. We're fine. And I mean, it's interesting, that first article I talked about where they said it's an issue in, you know, the sexual frustration is an issue in non-Western countries. So then what's the conclusion? A, we don't have any problem in the West. We found the answer. Now what we need to do is export that when we want to combat extremism. But my wife and I are opening a business actually on the internet to fight ISIS that way. Okay. So therefore, when we look at the Wahhabi and the Salafi theologies, they then, when they're taken by Al-Qaeda and ISIS and taken as an imperative, then it becomes an imperative that makes a demand on all believers within their own faith. Okay, so if you're not with us, you're against us, you're a non-believer. It reinforces sectarianism, and it also enables one to talk about going after people of other faiths. Therefore, you then go to your scripture and you say, the Quran talks about people of the book, but that's not like the people of the book today. Okay, so then you're getting into, again, you know, the taking of a text, not interpreting it within the context in which it was revealed and what it meant, but now doing a layover, you know, on it. Okay. All right. Okay. Therefore, those who resist or those who are apolitical become the enemy. Now, the important thing to realize is that religion then legitimates acts of terrorism in the name of God. And you couldn't want a stronger authority to motivate anybody. And it's not just has to be acts of terrorism. When I was growing up as a kid and we would see movies in terms of, let's say, World War II or even some other American wars, you'd have chaplains saying, we're going to win because we're on God's side. And you remember that President Reagan, when the Marines were killed in Beirut, said we don't have to pray for them, we know they're in heaven. In other words, you know, for a leader to be able to say, it's not just me, but I am taking the position that God would want, and in fact, not only that God would want, that God demands, sets up a level of certitude that then can be used for those who feel marginalized and on the periphery. I mean, think about, for example, if you look at the 9/11 attackers and the 7/7 attackers, they were not primarily driven by religion. They were driven by a lot of political issues, marginalization, what they saw going on in other parts of the world. But the reference to religion then gives you a certain certitude, and it gives you something to fight and something to die for. And knowing that when you die for it, there is a reward. Okay, now, if not simply religion, what are the root causes for the growth of terrorism? In most cases, as I said, they're political and economic. They become a means, religion becomes a means then to frame and legitimate, much as nationalism and democracy have done that. Nationalism and democracy were used in the 20th century for the greatest acts of violence, for taking out 300,000 people, bombing Nagasaki or Hiroshima. Makes 3,000 people in New York and Washington, and I'm not trying to denigrate 9/11, but I think, you know, one needs to realize that that level of reality can be used with any ideology that becomes, that will seem to be a positive ideology, but in others winds up being misused or misappropriated. Therefore, identity politics, as I said earlier, underlies sectarian and ethnic violence. But what are the issues? The issues are, many of them, political and socioeconomic. War and occupation of lands, authoritarian regimes and oppression. We forget that today because they're our allies. Pay me now or pay me later. Poverty and economic inequality. National, regional, ethnic, and tribal rivalries. Proxy wars and militias. Look at what's going on in terms of the role of the Gulf states, in terms of Iran and its policies. Gallup and Pew polling data, as well as major studies by Robert Pape, P-A-P-E, who's written definitively on suicide terrorism, as I don't say to my students till the end of the course. You want to get his seminal article? It's a shorter read, but he did a great job in his book as well. Pape looks at all the world religions over more than a 20-year period and finds that while at times religion may be the primary driver, most of the time it's the perception or experience of occupation and oppression. Okay. But some of the other issues that emerge and are exploited, they're issues that make for anti-Americanism or anti-Westernism among mainstream people in many parts of the world, but become then championed by extremists and terrorists, okay? Are U.S. and EU double standards in the promotion of democracy and human rights, their support for entrenched regimes, military assistance and arms sales. We've got data on that going back decades, and you can just look at the situation today in which it's been increased rather than decreased. Though bin Laden and al-Qaeda today appeal to Islam, the primary message and grievances that both have used are along those lines, okay? Western foreign policies, but more importantly, the realities within the Arab and Muslim world, okay? The authoritarian regimes, the role of the West in as it were, forming the Middle East, and the role of the West in supporting authoritarian regimes, and the role of the West in stepping back when we see the coup, for example, in Egypt, and normalizing relations with countries like Egypt, and strengthening relations with some of the Arab regimes, okay? So contexts become primary drivers. Texts do become a way to legitimate, okay? All right. Okay. All right. Okay. Now, what's important here, too, is the advantage when you're doing it in the name of extremism and terrorism, but you also, the issue was raised during the George W. Bush period and still exists within America. When you see your cause as moral and just, you then can come up with reasons for taking acts that are normally forbidden and immoral and legitimating them. Torture becomes acceptable. Beheading becomes acceptable, so does torture, so does waterboarding. You know, so does the kinds of situations that occurred in Abu Ghraib and other places, some of which is out there even in greater realities, I mean, in print, and yet never comes into our newspapers and is never part of our political rhetoric. The extent of some of the things that went on, but were justified in the minds of people in terms of they're the enemy, and to break them is the most important thing. Okay. Where do we go from here? Global violence and terrorism continue to threaten Muslim countries. The Center for Counterterrorism at West Point makes a very good point, which is that 87 to 92% of its victims are Muslim. Okay, and we forget that. We also forget, for example, domestically in Europe and America, that studies show that most of the violence committed are not by, is not driven by Islam or Muslims, but driven by far-right movements, often, certainly in America, white anti-government groups. The FBI's latest report, #1 terrorism, are these groups. The Southern Poverty Law Center has said that for the last 2 or 3 years. Lack of political inclusiveness in Arab countries has risked disaffected and alienated opponents to seek alternative means to express their political interest. And if you don't have the alternative means, and if elections and political participation are shut down rather than opened up, it's only a matter of time. Defeat ISIS and another group will come. You know, the feeling was kill bin Laden, maybe end al-Qaeda, and everything will end. Well, that's been going all the way back to Khomeini's time. You know, unless conditions change, there's going to be a problem. It's exacerbated by Sunni-Shia sectarian conflict and exploitation by Iran and some Gulf countries in their proxy wars. For groups like the Islamic State, religion becomes a tool to legitimate narratives of marginalization, discontent, recruit, mobilize on a global scale in the name of Islam. The entrenchment of authoritarian governments, the further entrenchment today, oops, sorry. Usually this means my wife, but it's not my wife this time. Okay. I'm okay. All right. Well, when you marry 50 years, it becomes fragile whether or not you're going to make it to the 51st. Okay. The entrenchment of authoritarian regimes, lack of or limited possibility for significant political representation and reform, government repression of mainstream Islamists and mainstream secularists, which is going on in countries like Egypt today. Perpetuate the search for alternative means, or for that option, for expression and power sharing. If and when ISIS, the so-called Islamic State, is neutralized or defeated, the potential for the formation of alternative groups championing a similar or revised narrative is strong, indeed inevitable. Moving forward, I think the U.S. and the EU face overarching challenges. The U.S. and the EU continue to be seen as siding with authoritarian regimes, despite their rhetorical commitment to democratic ideology. I would suggest you read the New York Times piece today. There's an editorial that actually says that Hillary got it right rather than Obama. Obama was too, almost principled, and therefore ultimately got involved in bringing Mubarak down sooner rather than later, whereas Hillary and her supporters were saying, you want to go very slowly. The whole idea being, obviously, that somehow elections would bring in the Muslim Brotherhood, and somehow the Muslim Brotherhood is the main culprit. Now, I am not defending the Muslim Brotherhood, but I have put this challenge out to an awful lot of people and never gotten a response. Take a spreadsheet and put in categories like massacre, killing, violence, imprisonment, torture, etc., and do the Morsi government, and then look at Sisi, and where do we go from there? Talk about beheadings by ISIS. We can think about a country in the Middle East that would trump ISIS in terms of the number of beheadings. U.S. justified its interventions, invasions, and occupation in the name of bringing democracy to Iraq and the Arab world, while also at the same time supporting the status quo of authoritarian allies. It's vacillated between using democracy as a diplomatic tool against some Arab powers and at the same time using regional violence, the terrorism of ISIS and AQ, and the danger of resultant chaos as justification for its support for its authoritarian Arab regimes, even closer support, and for the contracts that both the U.S. and the EU and the UK are enjoying, and for the level of arms sales that have gone on from the United States. The real need is for the U.S. and Europe. I know I'm being subtle here. The real need is for the U.S. and Europe to not only construct a new narrative that emphasizes self-determination, government accountability, and rule of law and human rights, upon which political actions and policies are based. So acts become important, not just narratives. I think we've discredited our narratives. It looked for a while when the Arab Spring came that there was an opportunity, not supporting all that was going on in the Arab Spring, to begin to move towards a new narrative, not the conventional wisdom, which was, we may not like these governments, but it's what assures stability is that we have these security authoritarian states, and that there would be this opening up. But in fact, the extent to which, post that coup, the United States refused to, and still refuses to call it a coup, the extent to which the Secretary of State at times was saying, oh, we see Sisi on the road to democratization, the extent to which both the U.S. and the EU might say, we really don't like that. Well, gee, when there's a massacre in a country that we don't like, look at the way we reacted to the killings in the Ukraine initially, which were actually quite small. Again, not denigrating, in the early days, but the way in which, within a short period of time, we have normalized relations and aid to countries like Egypt. Failure to address the root causes prioritizes stability and security and diverts from the critical need for institutional reforms. It justifies governments even more and more shutting down NGOs or having what Egypt has always had in recent years, government-regulated, non-government organizations, and which is true. In some countries, as you know, they're called royal NGOs. Failure to do so legitimates the widespread belief in the Arab world that the U.S. and EU have a double standard when it comes to the promotion and support for human rights. And it reinforces anti-Westernism as well as the mantra of militant extremists that neither Arab regimes nor Western allies can deliver or want to deliver, and therefore can fuel greater radicalization and recruitment by terrorist organizations. Thank you.